problem in this country, and we need to look at it as a public health problem. I think there's so many things like whether we're talking about opioids or others, when we look at it from a place of public health, then we can find solutions. We cannot politicize this any longer because it doesn't matter your political affiliation. It doesn't matter your zip code. It doesn't matter who you are. This can find you. And so we absolutely need to do everything in our power to make sure that we're doing right by our communities, we're leading with courage, and we're doing the things that we know are proven to work. Common sense gun safety laws, and we talked about some of them: secure storage, background checks, assault weapons bans, raising the minimum age. There's so many things we can be doing to help prevent this problem in the first place.
And it's crazy because I've talked to you before, I've talked to other people at Everytown and other organizations, and all of the responses are the same, where
You just heard the voice of someone who has watched too many parents bury their children because we as a nation cannot muster the political will to name the problem and solve it. And you better believe this is the moment when we confront the moral catastrophe that has turned America into the only developed nation on earth, where going to school is an act of courage, where sending your child to first grade requires a kind of faith that borders on the irrational, because gun death rates among children ages 1 to 17 have increased by 106% since 2013, and have been the leading cause of death among this group since 2020. And let me tell you what that means in a language that should shatter every comfortable assumption you hold about American exceptionalism, because there were 2,526 gun deaths in 2022 among 1 to 17-year-olds, averaging to nearly 7 per day, and if you think that statistic is bad, wait until you hear what happened next, because there have been at least 75 school shootings in the United States so far this year, as of December 13th, leaving at least 31 people dead, and more than 100 other victims injured, which means that while you were shopping for holiday gifts and planning your family gatherings, children were dying in American schools at a pace that would be considered a national emergency in any other context, but here we just call it Tuesday. And that Moms Demand Action leader you just heard is speaking a truth so fundamental, so utterly incontrovertible, that the fact we even need to have this conversation represents a civilizational failure of staggering proportions, because she said we need to treat this as a public health problem. Do you know why the right wing loses their absolute minds when they hear that framing? Because public health frameworks have worked for literally every other preventable cause of death in modern history. We didn't defeat polio by telling parents to pray harder, or by fortifying elementary schools with iron lungs. We created a vaccine and mandated its distribution. We didn't reduce automotive deaths by 90% since the 1970s, by putting armed guards at every intersection. We required seatbelts and airbags and crumple zones, and we treated car safety as an engineering problem, not a character test. When cigarettes were killing hundreds of thousands of Americans annually, we didn't respond by saying smokers just needed more personal responsibility. We regulated tobacco advertising and put warning labels on packages and implemented smoking bans in public spaces, and guess what? It worked, because public health interventions work when we have the courage to implement them. But here is where the story gets so enraging that you might want to sit down, because we actually have a control group for this experiment, and it is called Australia, and in 19one man killed 35 people and wounded another 23 with semi-automatic rifles at Port Arthur, Tasmania, the deadliest massacre in modern Australian history. That nation did something absolutely revolutionary by American standards, which is that they decided children's lives were more important than unfettered access to military-style weapons. Within weeks of the tragedy, Australian Prime Minister John Howard implemented critical changes to gun safety legislation with bipartisan state, territory, and Commonwealth support, and the results were so dramatic, so unambiguous, that they should be taught in every political science class as an example of what functional governance looks like, because Australia's 1996 gun law reforms were followed by more than a decade free of fatal mass shootings and accelerated declines in firearm deaths, particularly suicides, and in fact, the Port Arthur massacre was the 13th in Australia in 18 years, where 5 or more victims had died, and in the 20 years since there have been none. Let me repeat that because I want you to understand the scale of what is possible when political leaders actually lead instead of cowering before the gun lobby. Australia had 13 mass shootings in 18 years, then they passed comprehensive gun reform, and they had 0 mass shootings for the next 2 decades. Around 600,000 legal and illegal firearms were surrendered and later destroyed during the gun buyback, representing an estimated 20 to 30% of all the privately owned firearms in Australia at the time, and the nation did not descend into tyranny, and criminals did not suddenly rule the streets and law-abiding citizens retained the ability to own firearms for legitimate purposes, but they did stop having kindergarteners murdered in their classrooms with weapons designed for warfare. And here is the part that should make your blood boil with righteous fury, because when that mom's demand leader talks about secure storage and background checks and assault weapons bans and raising the minimum age, she is not proposing some radical untested social experiment. She is describing policies that have been proven to work in every other developed democracy on Earth. These are children who should be alive, they should be around, these are not deaths that should have occurred, they are preventable, and yet we as a nation have made the collective decision that the convenience of gun owners who want instant access to unlimited firepower is more important than the lives of 7 children every single day. Now you know what the Republican response to this crisis has been, and I want you to really sit with the absurdity of it, because they talk about doors, they talk about mental health, they talk about video games, they talk about everything except the actual variable that distinguishes America from every other wealthy nation, which is that we have flooded our society with 400 million firearms and made it easier to buy an AR-15 than to register to vote in some states. They say the problem is not guns, it is doors, as if Australian schools do not have doors, as if Japanese schools operate in some kind of magical doorless utopia where children simply phase through walls. The door argument is such breathtaking cynicism, such transparent bad faith, that it would be comedically absurd if it were not getting children killed, because here is the thing about doors. Every other country has them, and yet somehow they are not experiencing daily school shootings. And when they pivot to mental illness, because of course they do, let me tell you something that should end that deflection forever. States with more lenient gun laws have more pediatric deaths from gunshots, which means this is not about some unique American pathology of mental illness, because we do not have 10 times the rate of depression or schizophrenia as Germany or Canada. What we have is 10 times the rate of guns. Mental illness exists everywhere. Gun violence at this scale exists here, because we have made it uniquely easy for people in crisis to access weapons capable of producing mass casualties in seconds. Every other developed nation has mentally ill people, and video games and broken families and social media, and yet they do not have this problem, because they treat firearm access as a privilege that comes with responsibilities, rather than an absolute right that supersedes the right of children to survive their education. But here is where we need to talk about the current political reality, because you need to understand how dire the situation has become, and the new Trump administration has revoked multiple gun safety initiatives in the interest of preserving Second Amendment rights, which is Orwellian doublespeak for prioritizing gun manufacturers' profits over children's lives. And it gets worse because the budget bill for the 2025 fiscal year seeks to eliminate funding for any research relating to gunshot injury or mortality prevention that treats crimes committed with a firearm as a public health epidemic, which means they are not just refusing to solve the problem, they are actively trying to prevent us from studying the problem, because if we actually had comprehensive research documenting which interventions work, then it becomes much harder to claim that nothing can be done. This is the same playbook tobacco companies used for decades when they suppressed research showing cigarettes caused cancer, because if you can keep the science uncertain, you can keep the policy paralyzed, and that is exactly what the gun lobby wants, because they understand something that too many Democrats refuse to acknowledge, which is that the data is absolutely devastating to their position. When researchers can show that child access prevention laws are effective in preventing injuries and deaths, and have been shown to decrease suicides and unintentional injuries in children, suddenly it becomes very difficult to argue against them without admitting that you value ideological purity over dead kids. And I want to address something directly to the enlightened centrists who are already preparing their both sides takes, because yes, Australia and America are different countries with different constitutions and different cultures, but you know what is not different? Physics. A bullet fired from an AR-15 in Australia has the same kinetic energy as a bullet fired from an AR-15 in Texas. A 5-year-old child in Melbourne has the same biological vulnerability to gunshot wounds as a 5-year-old child in Ohio. The laws of ballistics do not change based on your national identity, which means that when you reduce access to the most lethal categories of weapons, you reduce casualties from those weapons. And this is not complicated social science. This is basic material causation. Now let me tell you what that public health framework actually looks like in practice, because this is where progressives need to get much more aggressive in framing this debate. And it starts by understanding that we have successfully addressed every other major cause of preventable death in modern American history through comprehensive regulatory frameworks that balance individual liberty with collective safety. Nobody thinks the FDA is tyranny when it prevents pharmaceutical companies from selling thalidomide, Nobody considers building codes to be authoritarian overreach when they require fire exits. Nobody argues that restaurant health inspections violate freedom when they prevent salmonella outbreaks. We have decided as a society that certain activities carry externalized risks that justify public regulation, and the possession of devices specifically engineered to project lethal force at high velocity is the definition of an activity with externalized risks. The public health model means we start with data collection, which is why the gun lobby has fought for decades to prevent the CDC from studying gun violence, because they know what the data will show. It means we identify risk factors and high-risk populations not to stigmatize them, but to target interventions where they will be most effective. It means we implement evidence-based policy solutions, and then we measure outcomes and we adjust based on what works. This is not radical. This is how we have addressed literally every other public health crisis from HIV to opioids to traffic safety, and the only reason we do not apply this framework to guns is because the gun industry has captured our political system to such an extent that they can successfully argue that studying how to prevent gun deaths somehow infringes on constitutional rights. And let us talk about those constitutional rights for a moment, because I am so tired of this reflexive invocation of the Second Amendment, as if it is some kind of magic spell that ends all policy discussion when in reality, every constitutional right is subject to reasonable regulation, and the Supreme Court has acknowledged this repeatedly. You have a First Amendment right to free speech, but you cannot shout fire in a crowded theater. You have a Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable search and seizure, but police can still obtain warrants. You have a Second Amendment right to bear arms, but that does not mean you have an absolute unfettered right to own any weapon, in any context under any circumstances, with no accountability whatsoever. After the 2010 landmark Supreme Court case McDonald v. Chicago ruling that said state and local governments must comply with the Second Amendment, states across the country changed their gun laws in both directions, with states like Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas enacting much more aggressive laws in terms of freedom of access, freedom of carry laws about concealed carry in churches, laws about stand your ground, making it easier to get a firearm quickly and to carry on. And guess what happened? Firearm death rates among children and adolescents vary considerably by state, with the states with the highest firearm death rates from 2020 to 2023 being the District of Columbia, Mississippi, and Louisiana, which means we have run the experiment and the results are in, and the states with the weakest gun laws have the most dead children. But here is what gives me hope, even in this moment of profound darkness, and it is the fact that as 2025 gets underway, there is no stopping progress in states across the country, because when it comes to the leading cause of death for children and teens, nothing will stand in the way, according to gun safety advocates. And this is where the grassroots energy becomes absolutely crucial, because federal action may be blocked by a Republican Congress beholden to the gun lobby, but state legislatures and governors and local prosecutors can still implement meaningful reforms. We have seen this pattern before with marriage equality and marijuana legalization, and minimum wage increases, where change happens from the bottom up through state-level organizing until the federal government is forced to catch up, and that is exactly the strategy that gun safety advocates need to pursue, with maximum urgency. And I want to be very clear about what is at stake here, because this is not some abstract policy debate. This is a question of whether we are going to remain a society capable of protecting our children, or whether we have so thoroughly subordinated collective well-being to individual gun rights that we are willing to accept mass child death as the price of freedom. School shootings are on the rise, with the U.S. average yearly rate of student exposure to a school shooting increasing threefold over time from 19 per 10 for 100,000 students in 1999-2004 to 51 in 2020-2024, and every single one of those students who survived will carry the trauma for the rest of their lives. Research has found that youth antidepressant use and suicide risk increased in communities with exposures to school shootings, which means the harm radiates outward in concentric circles, affecting not just the immediate victims but entire school communities, entire cities, entire generations of young people who are growing up with the knowledge that they might be murdered while learning algebra. And when you hear conservatives say that arming teachers or hardening schools is the answer, understand that this is fundamentally a counsel of despair, because it accepts as inevitable that American children will continue to be targeted for mass violence, and the only question is how we manage that violence once it occurs rather than preventing it in the first place. It transforms schools from institutions of learning into fortified checkpoints. It asks teachers who are already underpaid and undervalued to add armed security guard to their job descriptions. It normalizes for children the idea that they live in a war zone. This is not a solution. This is a surrender. This is the dying gasp of a political movement that has run out of legitimate arguments and is desperately trying to avoid confronting the evidence. Because here is the evidence laid bare. There has been a 715% increase in the number of people wounded and killed in school shootings between 2004 and 2024, which is not a statistic that suggests we need minor tweaks around the margins, or more thoughts and prayers, or better door locks. That is a number that screams systemic crisis that demands transformative policy change, and the fact that we have comprehensive data from Australia and from every other developed nation showing exactly how to solve this problem makes our continued inaction not just tragic but morally culpable. Every parent in Congress who votes against universal background checks, every governor who signs permitless carry legislation, every senator who blocks assault weapons bans is making an affirmative choice that maintaining easy access to weapons of war is more important than preventing their own constituents' children from being shot to death. And I want you to understand the class dynamics at play here, because the communities most affected by gun violence are disproportionately black and brown and poor, while the gun rights absolutists tend to be disproportionately white and rural and working class, which means this is not just a public health crisis, it is a racial justice crisis. Among black youth aged 1 to 17, they have a gun death rate 6 times higher than their white counterparts, and the gun homicide rate for Hispanic and Latino kids and teens has increased by 70%. And this is why the gun control debate cannot be separated from larger conversations about structural racism and economic inequality, because gun violence is concentrated in communities that have been systematically disinvested in and abandoned by policymakers. When you combine easy gun access with economic desperation, with inadequate mental health services, with over-policing and under-resourcing, you create the conditions for epidemic violence and then you blame the victims for not making better choices. The public health framework that the Moms Demand leader advocates for would actually address these root causes, because public health is about creating conditions where everyone can thrive, not just punishing individual failures. It means investing in violence interruption programs that have been shown to reduce shootings by treating them as contagious rather than inevitable. It means expanding access to mental health treatment, especially for young people experiencing crisis. It means secure storage laws that prevent impulsive access to firearms during moments of desperation. It means comprehensive background checks that keep guns out of the hands of domestic abusers and people with violent criminal histories. None of this infringes on legitimate gun ownership, and all of it saves lives, but it requires accepting that your right to convenience does not supersede someone else's child's right to survive. And here is what I need you to understand as we move into the next election cycle, because this is going to be the absolute defining issue for young voters who have spent their entire lives doing active shooter drills and wondering if today is the day they die at school. There is no middle ground on this anymore. There is no splitting the difference between protecting children and protecting gun rights, because every day we delay implementing comprehensive reform, another 7 children die. You cannot triangulate your way out of a public health crisis. You cannot poll test your way to moral clarity. You cannot focus group your way around the fundamental choice between weapons designed for killing and children's right to live. The conservative position has been thoroughly discredited by the evidence from Australia, from Japan, from the UK, from every developed nation that has implemented serious gun control and seen dramatic reductions in gun violence. Their arguments about mental illness fall apart when you look at international comparisons. Their claims about good guys with guns, stopping bad guys with guns, are contradicted by the data showing that more guns equals more gun deaths. Their insistence that nothing can be done is revealed as cowardice masquerading as constitutional principle, and yet they persist because the gun lobby has bottomless resources and a fanatically motivated base and a propaganda apparatus that successfully convinces millions of Americans that common sense regulation represents tyranny. This is why we need that Moms Demand action energy multiplied by a factor of 10 across every state legislature, every school board, every city council in America, because the only way we overcome entrenched gun lobby power is through sustained grassroots organizing that makes politicians more afraid of voting against gun safety than voting for it. We need to primary every Democrat who waffles on this issue. We need to make gun safety a litmus test for progressive endorsement. We need to build a political movement that says clearly and unequivocally that if you prioritize gun manufacturers' profits over children's lives, you will be removed from office. This is not radical. This is the bare minimum standard we should expect from our representatives in a functioning democracy. And to everyone who says this is too politically difficult or we need to focus on issues that unite rather than divide, understand that gun violence is the leading cause of death among children and teens in the U.S., which means that if we cannot muster the political will to address the leading cause of child death, we have fundamentally failed as a society. There is no participation trophy for trying hard, there is no points for good intentions, there are only outcomes, and the outcome of our current policy is thousands of dead children annually, and hundreds of thousands more traumatized by exposure to gun violence. That is not acceptable, that is not sustainable, that is not the price we have to pay for freedom, that is the price we are paying for cowardice. So when you hear that Moms Demand leader talking about public health solutions and evidence-based policies and doing right by our communities, understand that she is offering a roadmap to a future where American children have the same expectation of safety that children in Australia and Canada, Germany and Japan take for granted. She is pointing to a reality where schools can be places of learning instead of potential massacre sites, where parents can drop their kids off without wondering if they will see them again, where an entire generation is not growing up with PTSD from active shooter drills. That future is possible. We have proof that it works. We have evidence showing exactly which policies prevent which harms, and the only thing standing between us and that future is political will. And I am telling you that political will can be created through organizing, through education, through making this issue so central to every election that politicians have no choice but to act. We did it with seatbelt laws, we did it with smoking bans, we did it with drunk driving enforcement, and we can do it with comprehensive gun safety legislation, but it requires treating this with the urgency it deserves, which means understanding that every day of delay is measured in children's lives. This is the moral test of our generation. This is the issue that will determine whether we are remembered as the people who finally said enough, or as the people who looked at the carnage and decided that guns mattered more than kids. And I know which side of that history I want to be on, and I hope you do too, because those children that Moms Demand leader is fighting for are running out of time, and they are depending on us to fight like their lives depend on it, because they literally do.